The hidden gods of Rome weren't just superstition, they were a survival manual, disguised as faith. Imagine a farmer waking at dawn, facing uncertain weather, pests, and soil that could betray him. He didn't just rely on sweat and tools, he turned to the spirits of the land. That was Arabagus, Gaudianagus wheat rust, and Pomona, caretaker of fruit trees. These names don't appear in epic battles or marble arches, yet they determined whether Rome ate or starved. By pouring a libation or muttering a quick prayer, farmers gave structure to the chaos of nature. It was a way of saying, I can't control the storm, but maybe someone out there can. Faith in these gods wasn't about grandeur, it was about survival. Without their quiet protection, Rome's legions would have marched on empty stomachs, and no emperor could have built an empire on famine. In this way, the forgotten gods were the empire's foundation, quiet, unseen, but vital. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings, shows us how Romans saw every transition as sacred. From the moment you left your home, stepped across a threshold, or even began a journey, Janus was there. His statues, carved with one face looking forward and another looking back, embodied Rome's obsession with balance between past and future. A soldier heading to war might whisper a prayer to Janus, asking for safe passage, while a senator might invoke him before opening a new session. Doors, gates, even metaphorical beginnings all fell under his gaze. To modern eyes, it may seem excessive, but to Romans, it meant that nothing was random. The start of a project, the first words of a speech, or the opening of a campaign were dangerous moments that required divine approval. Janus wasn't hidden in the sense of obscurity, but hidden in plain sight everywhere, woven into the simple act of starting something. His quiet power shows how Romans turned everyday moments into cosmic events. Clochina, goddess of the sewers, might sound like a divine joke, but to Romans she was no less important than Jupiter himself. Beneath the marble streets of Rome ran the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system that kept the city alive. Without it, disease would have swept through crowded neighborhoods, turning the empire's heart into a graveyard. By worshipping Clochina, Romans acknowledged something revolutionary. Cleanliness was sacred. They built shrines near sewer outlets, offered flowers, and treated the unseen world of waste as part of the divine order. Imagine a merchant praying at a sewer shrine before opening his shop. Odd to us, but practical to them. By sacralizing sanitation, they reinforced the idea that every part of life, even the dirty and unpleasant, had cosmic value. Clochina shows us how Rome thrived not only by conquest but also by respecting the hidden systems that kept millions alive. A goddess of sewers wasn't ridiculous, she was essential. Cardia, the goddess of hinges, might be the strangest divine figure in Rome's hidden pantheon. Yet for Romans, hinges weren't just metal. They symbolized protection and transformation. Doors kept danger out, but also let opportunity in. By honoring Cardia, families asked for safety at night and blessings when opening to the world each morning. Priests invoked her during rites to ward off evil spirits, believing that every creak of a hinge echoed a spiritual boundary being crossed. In a city crowded with strangers, thieves, and political intrigue, protecting one's doorway was as vital as defending the empire's frontiers. Cardia reminds us that Roman religion was deeply practical. The divine didn't just live in the skies, but in every creaking door and turning key. To us, she's a curiosity. To them, she was a guardian. Her presence tells us that faith was as much about locks and hinges as about temples and thrones. Ditashta, the silent goddess, represents one of the strangest yet most haunting aspects of Roman belief. Her cult revolved around keeping harmful gossip and curses at bay. In a world where rumors could topple senators or spark riots, silence itself became sacred. Rituals for Ditashita often involved sealing the mouth with lead, symbolically locking away dangerous words. To Romans, silence wasn't weakness, it was power. The ability to control speech in a city where words built empires and destroyed reputations. Imagine a politician whispering prayers to her before a heated debate, or a family invoking her name to protect against slander from jealous neighbors. In Ditashita, we see how Romans recognized the invisible but deadly force of words. She wasn't hidden because she was obscure. She was hidden because her power lived in silence. by worshipping her. Romans admitted that sometimes the deadliest weapon wasn't a sword, but a whisper. Volumnus and Pecumnus were guardian spirits for newborns, protecting infants from harm and illness, in an age where infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. These minor gods offered fragile families hope. Their rituals were humble, placing protective charms by cradles, muttering prayers in the night, but they mattered more than golden temples. For every emperor's triumphal arch, countless households were praying simply for their babies to survive. By honoring Volumnus and Pecumnus, Romans acknowledged that empire wasn't sustained by victories alone, but by the survival of its children. These hidden gods kept watch over the most vulnerable, proving that Roman faith wasn't just about power, but about tenderness and fear. When we look back at Rome's forgotten gods, it's these intimate moments that feel most human. They remind us that faith, at its core, is born from love and vulnerability. Without them, Rome's story feels incomplete. Terminus, god of boundaries, might seem small compared to Mars or Jupiter, but he shaped Rome's expansion. Stones marked with his blessing set the limits of fields, neighborhoods, and provinces. To cross a terminus stone without respect was to invite divine wrath. Farmers held ceremonies at their boundary markers, offering grain or wine to secure the land's protection. For Rome, boundaries were more than lines on a map, they were sacred. Terminus symbolized order in a world that could so easily fall into chaos. His worship shows us how Romans saw land not merely as property but as destiny. By protecting boundaries, they protected identity itself. It's easy to overlook him, but without Terminus, Rome's vast territories would have been vulnerable, not just to invaders, but to disputes from within. Hidden gods like him were the glue holding the empire's structure together. Vaticanus, a spirit tied to the first cries of newborns, embodies how Romans saw the sacred in life's smallest beginnings. The very breath of a child was infused with divine presence, and parents often offered thanks when those cries filled their home. In a city of political speeches and public oratory, the tiny cry of a baby carried cosmic wit was the first voice of a new Roman citizen. To worship Vaticanus was to acknowledge the future of Rome itself, fragile but full of possibility. His presence in the pantheon reminds us that power didn't only come from emperors commanding legions, but also from ordinary families bringing life into the world. By safeguarding that first cry, Vaticanus safeguarded Rome's tomorrow. Fornax, the goddess of Arvins, reveals just how grounded Roman religion was in daily survival. Every loaf of bread, every meal shared at a family table, fell under her watch. Festivals in her honor were simple but vital, ensuring that fire baked evenly, bread rose well, and communities stayed fed. To modern readers, a goddess of ovens might sound trivial, but in Rome, food was life. Grain shortages sparked riots, toppled leaders, and threatened empire-wide stability. Fornax was more than a kitchen spirit. She was the silent force keeping Rome's people alive and its streets calm. Her cult shows us how faith was tied to hunger, how even humble ovens could become sacred altars. By remembering Fornax, we see Rome's hidden gods not as curiosities, but as the hidden gods of Rome form a tapestry that reveals the empire's deepest anxieties and hopes. They were never about grand processions or marble statues. They were about survival. Whether it was hinges keeping homes safe, sewers keeping cities clean, or whispers kept silent, these gods held together the invisible threads of daily life. By ignoring them, history gives us a Rome of emperors and battles. By remembering them, we see a Rome of families, farmers, children, and merchants, all held in balance by gods who asked for little but gave much. Their obscurity doesn't make them irrelevant. It makes them essential. To truly understand Rome, we must look not only at the Caesars who commanded armies, but also at the forgotten deities who guarded babies, ovens, and boundaries. Without them, the empire would have been marble on the outside, hollow within. When we think of Rome, the spotlight always lands on Jupiter, the thunder-throwing king of the gods. Yet for ordinary Romans, divinity wasn't always about spectacle. It was about survival in the cracks of daily life. Consider Fabulinus, a tiny household spirit believed to help children speak their first words. To us, it may sound like wishful parenting, but to them, it was sacred speech. was the passport to Roman identity. A child who spoke well might become a senator, an orator, even a future emperor. The first stammer or syllable carried cosmic importance. Families would whisper thanks to fabulinus. When toddlers began forming sounds, treating language itself as divine in a society where rhetoric ruled politics, honoring the god of speech wasn't silly, it was practical, even visionary. Another hidden deity, Kuba, was thought to protect children as they slept. Romans feared the vulnerability of the night. When disease or nightmares could strike, shrines to Kuba were humble, often nothing more than household offerings, but the belief itself revealed Rome's fears and tenderness. Night was dangerous in ancient cities filled with noise, filth, and superstition. Parents prayed that their infants would not be stolen by illness or haunted by spirits. By turning sleep into something divine, Kuba became an anchor of comfort. She reminds us that faith in Rome wasn't only about conquest or state. It was also about love, about parents desperate to shield their children. Through Kuba, we see Rome not as a war machine, but as a network of homes. In ancient markets, theft was a constant threat. This gave rise to deities like Limitonus, who guarded thresholds not just of houses, but of shops. Merchants believed that every doorway was a battlefield between prosperity and loss. By leaving offerings at entrances, they sought divine insurance against thieves and frauds. It might seem strange to place cosmic weight on a shop door, but for a Roman craftsman, one bad theft could ruin his family. Limitonus, then, wasn't trivial. He was essential. He symbolized trust, the invisible contract between seller and buyer. In a society where markets were lifelines, gods of thresholds weren't minor, they were pillars of survival. Romans also believed in obscure protective spirits called lares compitals, guardians of crossroads. These deities oversaw the points where streets met, where strangers crossed paths, and where danger often lurked. Shrines to them dotted neighborhoods, decorated with small statues and offerings of honeycakes. At first glance, they seem insignificant, but crossroads were volatile spaces, markets of gossip, meeting points of gangs, or venues for quick ambushes. By making them sacred, Romans turned chaos into order. Even the humblest alleyway carried divine significance. To worship the lares compitals was to keep peace in the streets, transforming neighborhoods into sacred zones of safety. A fascinating example of Rome's hidden gods is Pales, deity of shepherds and livestock. For an empire built partly on agriculture, her role was crucial. Every spring, Romans celebrated the festival of Parelia, where bonfires were leapt over to purify flocks and shepherds alike. Two city elites. This royal ritual may have looked rustic, and backward, but it was essential to Rome's survival. Without strong flocks, the legions had no food, no wool for clothing, and no leather for armor. Pales embodied the raw, pastoral lifeblood of the empire. By worshipping her, Romans acknowledged that even in an age of marble and politics, survival still began with sheep in a field. Another forgotten protector was Verminus, god against cattle diseases. While his name never echoed in Senate debates, farmers whispered it in terror during outbreaks. Sacrifices were made to protect herds from plague, because a sick herd meant famine. The power of Verminus lies in his invisibility. He doesn't appear in legends because his domain was too practical, too grounded, yet his existence proves how Roman religion mapped itself onto every anxiety, even the fear of animal illness. His coat was a reminder that Rome wasn't only defended by swords, but also by the fragile health of its animals. The goddess Rumina, associated with breastfeeding, is another striking example of Roman pragmatism. Shrines dedicated to her stood under fig trees, where mothers offered milk rather than wine. Rumina embodied maternal survival, the link between mother and infant that kept Rome's population alive. Without her blessing, a baby's first months could mean tragedy. The fact that Rome honored her shows a sensitivity often overlooked. Empire depended on nurturing as much as on conquest. While emperors raised armies, mothers raised citizens, and Rumina sanctified that bond. In her, we glimpse the heart of Rome's humanity. Even shadows had divine guardians. The god Muta was linked to silence in rituals, ensuring that sacred ceremonies weren't corrupted by careless words. This small role carried enormous weight in a city obsessed with omens. A slip of the tongue during sacrifice could doom an entire campaign. Priests invoked Muta, not for glory, but for precision, asking him to mute unneeded chatter. Imagine generals waiting for a favorable omen. Their breath held, their words silenced by faith. Muta's power was invisible, but immense, enforcing discipline where human nerves might fail. His obscurity reflects how Romans saw silence, not as emptiness, but as divine order. Fors Fortuna, goddess of luck, had shrines along the Tiber River where sailors, traders, and even emperors prayed. Her presence in the hidden pantheon shows that Romans admitted a simple truth. Success was never entirely earned. Fortune was a goddess to be courted, bribed, and respected. She embodied the randomness of life in an empire, where a storm could sink a fleet, or a single vote could decide a man's fate. While Fortuna is better known, Fors Fortuna reflects the humbler side of luck, everyday chance that guided ordinary Romans. Her cult was less about destiny and more about daily survival. All these hidden gods show us a Rome that was alive with superstition, ritual, and sacred anxiety. They reveal how Romans filled the gaps of control with faith, turning every uncertainty into a divine presence. This wasn't weakness, it was resilience. By naming forces they couldn't master, they transformed fear into ritual. Every hinge, boundary, rumor, and harvest became manageable through divine guardianship. To walk through Rome was to step through a city layered with godsome. Some were rated, some whispered about, and many forgotten. Together, they show that Rome's true strength wasn't just legions or it was the invisible web of belief that bound society in every breath, word, and act. Not all gods of Rome were tied to grandeur or empire-wide rituals. Some lived in the smallest corners of life. One such figure was Melona, goddess of honey and bees. While her cult wasn't large, she symbolized the importance of bees to Roman agriculture. Honey was more than sweetness, it was medicine, offering, and preservation. Romans offered prayers to Melona to protect hives from disease and ensure abundance. In her, we see how Roman spirituality was practical. Every swarm of bees could make or break a family's livelihood. Melona's quiet role reminds us that even buzzing insects were part of the empire's sacred machinery. A little-known deity named Sea governed the seed planted in the soil, while Sigicia protected the sprouting shoots, and Tudolina guarded the ripened crops. These three formed a chain of divine protection over every stage of agriculture. To us, it feels obsessive to have a god for each step. But for Romans, it was logical. Every phase carried risk. Seeds might rot, sprouts might die, harvests might fail. By dividing responsibility among different gods, Romans mapped their fears onto the divine. These names rarely appear in textbooks, but without them, the faith of farmers would have felt incomplete. They were unseen guardians of Rome's breadbasket. Acata and Sarata were gods of plowing and weeding, honored by farmers before these weren't glamorous deities, but functional ones, embodying the sweat of agriculture. A prayer to Sarata before pulling weeds was less about magic and more about mindset, turning labor into sacred duty. Romans understood that empire rested on the soil, and every weed removed was a small victory in the eternal war against famine. Invoking these deities turned drudgery into ritual, reinforcing the dignity of work. It was religion not as spectacle, but as discipline-making. Even the humblest task part of Rome's sacred rhythm. The god Vivactor was invoked at the start of plowing, symbolizing the breaking of land before seeds were sown. His presence shows us how Romans understood beginnings as perilous. To start plowing was to gamble with weather, pests, and fate. By sanctifying the act, farmers gave themselves courage. Vivactor's cult was never about temples or statues, but about whispered invocations in muddy fields. This kind of worship gave ordinary Romans dignity, tying their survival to the cosmic order. It reminds us that Roman religion wasn't only urban and Marblelet, was rural, sweaty, and rooted in earth. The obscure goddess Noditis was believed to guard against crop diseases that caused swelling or knots in grain stalks. To modern minds, this may seem bizarre, but for ancient farmers, Disease could mean catastrophe. By naming the threat and giving it a divine counterpart, Romans made the invisible manageable. Notitus embodies a pattern. By mapping fears onto gods, they gained psychological control. This wasn't just superstition, it was a survival strategy. Through Nodatus, we see Rome not as a cold empire of steel, but as a society endlessly negotiating with nature through ritual and imagination. Flora, more famous than many hidden gods, governed flowers and blossoming plants, but her role wasn't decorative, it was deeply practical. Festivals in her honor, Floralia ensured fertility of fields and abundance of crops. Citizens would celebrate with games, feasts, and offerings, marking the renewal of life. To Romans, flowers weren't luxuries, they were indicators of fertile land. Flora's cult shows us that beauty and necessity intertwined in Roman thought. By worshipping her, they acknowledged that survival and joy were inseparable. She reminds us that hidden gods weren't always grim protectors, they could also embody celebration. Vulcanus, god of the Tiber River, reveals the importance of waterways in Roman life. While Neptune ruled the seas, Vulcanus governed the local currents that fed Rome's heart. Merchants, fishermen, and travelers prayed for safe passage, offering tokens along the riverbanks. Without Vulcanus, Rome's trade lifeline might have felt insecure. His obscurity highlights how Romans localized divinity, tying gods not just to universal domains, but to specific rivers, fields, and hills. The empire wasn't held together only by legions, but also by faith and local guardians. Every Roman household honored Penates, domestic gods of the pantry. While not entirely forgotten, their role is overshadowed by Jupiter and Mars. The Penates were protectors of food stores, ensuring families never went hungry. Offerings of bread, wine, or salt were made daily. Their worship was intimate, reminding us that Roman faith wasn't always about public spectacle. It lived in kitchens, dining rooms, and whispered prayers over meals. Without the Penates, Rome's grandeur would collapse, because an empire is nothing if its families starve. They may be hidden, but their quiet constancy sustained Rome's heartbeat. The spirit paver personified fear itself. Soldiers invoked him to ward off panic in battle, hoping their enemies would feel his icy grip instead. It's a fascinating concept. Rome turned even fear into something sacred. By deifying fear, they acknowledged its power but tried to control it. Paver reminds us that Romans were realists. They didn't deny emotions, they gave them names, altars, and rituals. In a society built on conquest, fear was both weapon and weakness. Worshipping Paver turned dread into strategy, making even terror part of Rome's arsenal. Obscure but telling, the goddess Febris represented fever. Romans feared illness in their crowded, unsanitary cities, and shrines to Febris sought her mercy. Worshippers left offerings in hopes of protection from plague. While primitive, this ritual reflects a profound truth. Romans saw disease as divine. By personifying fever, they framed suffering not as random cruelty, but as negotiation with the goddess. Febris embodies Rome's way of coping, transforming helplessness into ritual. She was hidden, yes, but essential. Her presence proves that Rome's divine world mirrored its real, fragile existence. Fortuna was more than a goddess of Luci, was the living embodiment of Rome's obsession with chance, fate, and control. Her temples weren't built only for gamblers or soldiers hoping for victory. Even emperors humbled themselves before her wheel of fortune. Imagine a general fresh from conquest, parading through the city in a triumph, yet still offering sacrifices to Fortuna, acknowledging that his glory could vanish with a single twist of her will. Romans lived with this tension daily, never sure if tomorrow would bring triumph or ruin. Coins minted with her image weren't just art, they were propaganda, reminders that the empire's destiny hung in her hands. Fortuna's cult mixed hope with fear, promising blessings but warning of sudden reversals. She wasn't the gentle guardian of fortune we romanticize today. She was fickle, unpredictable, and often cruel. By worshipping her, Romans admitted a truth we still wrestle with. Success is never entirely in our control. Forgotten by many now, Fortuna's shadow lingers every time someone mutters about luck, proving her influence never fully disappeared. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and transitions, was perhaps the most Roman of all deities. His domain wasn't war, harvests, or love, but the very flow of time itself, past and future, entrances and exits, peace and war. Romans turned to him at every threshold. Marriages, treaties, campaigns, even the first day of the year. His temple in the Forum was more than stone. Its open or closed doors symbolized Rome's state of war or peace. This wasn't abstract theology. It was a living barometer of the empire's heartbeat. When Janus looked forward, Rome marched into new conquests. When he looked back, the city reflected on victories and losses. Unlike other gods, Janus didn't need myths or epic battles. His power lay in the rhythm of daily life, forgotten in modern times. His dual gaze still resonates. Whenever we face crossroads or turn the page on a new chapter, Janus teaches us that power isn't just in actions, but in the choices that precede them. Choices that define entire empires. Labitina, the goddess of funerals, might have been the most unsettling figure in Rome's pantheon. She wasn't about glorious afterlives or heavenly promises. Her domain was the logistics of death itself. From undertakers to mourners, from coffins to burial rites, Labitina oversaw the business of saying goodbye. Her temple doubled as a registry for the dead, a place where life's ending was officially acknowledged. Imagine a bustling city like Rome, where plagues, wars, and accidents made death an everyday visitor. Labitina's presence was impossible to ignore. Unlike Pluto or Hades, who ruled the underworld, Labitina was practical, almost bureaucratic, turning grief into ritual. Her cult reveals how Romans balanced respect with efficiency, ensuring the dead were honored while the living kept moving. She reminds us that empires aren't just built on victories and monuments, but also on how they handle loss, decay, and memory. Today, her name is nearly erased, but her shadow lingers in every funeral custom we take for granted. Bellona, the shadowy goddess of war, stood apart from Mars by embodying the darker, bloodier side of battle, where Mars represented strategy, valor, and Rome's martial pride. Bellona was frenzy, fire, and chaos. Her priests, called Bellenari, were infamous for their wild rituals, sometimes cutting themselves to offer blood as devotion. In times of conflict, her cult captured the raw brutality of war, reminding citizens that conquest was never clean. Imagine soldiers preparing for campaign. Hear in the screams of ritual frenzy, knowing battle would soon demand the same madness. Bellona wasn't worshipped for comfort. She was invoked for power when reason wasn't enough. Rome needed Mars to justify its wars, but it needed Bellona to survive them. Forgotten now, she personifies the truth. We'd prefer to ignore that behind every polished statue of victory lies the chaos of battlefields soaked in blood. Her absence in our memory shows how quickly we cover the violent costs of empire with stories of glory. Spes, the goddess of hope, might sound soft compared to gods of war and fortune, but her role was profound. In a city constantly threatened by famine, invasion, or political chaos, Spes was the last thread people clung to. When all else failed, temples to Spes weren't grand like those of Jupiter, but they were vital sanctuaries where ordinary Romans whispered prayers for better days. Soldiers marched with her name on their lips. Families invoked her when planting crops, and exiles carried her image in their hearts. Spes wasn't naive optimism. She was survival itself. Rome's endurance wasn't just built on legions or walls, but on a stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better than today. Forgotten now, Spes reminds us that hope is never trivial. It is the silent engine that drives people to endure wars, losses, and empires that rise and fall. Without her, Rome might have collapsed long before history remembered its name. Concordia, goddess of harmony, was one of Rome's most politically charged deities. Her temples weren't built only for prayers, but for public statements, symbols that Rome could maintain unity despite class struggles, senatorial rivalries, or civil wars. Statues of Concordia stood as reminders that peace within was as critical as victories abroad. Yet her worship was often ironic, for she thrived in a city constantly on the brink of internal collapse. Politicians invoked her name to push their agendas. Emperors used her image to legitimize their rule, and citizens clung to her in times of riots. She reveals Rome's paradox: an empire preaching harmony while thriving on division. Forgotten today. Concordia whispers and uncomfortable truths. Societies often need the appearance of unity more than unity itself. Etiquette wasn't about solving conflict, but about disguising it. A lesson as relevant in modern politics as it was in ancient Rome. Terminus, the god of boundaries, seems obscure, but his role was essential in a city obsessed with law, property, and order. Every stone that marked a field or estate was sacred to him. A reminder that even empires needed rules to function. Romans believed moving a boundary stone without proper ritual risked divine wrath, making Terminus both legal guardian and silent enforcer. His shrine inside the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill symbolized that even the king of gods respected limits in an empire fueled by conquest. This was ironic. While Rome pushed its borders endlessly, within the city, boundaries were inviolable. Terminus represented stability, a god of enough in a culture that rarely stopped expanding. Forgotten now, he embodies the tension between ambition and restraint, reminding us that empires survive not just by winning wars, but by knowing where to draw their lines. His absence in memory shows how quickly we overlook gods of order in favor of gods of chaos. Salus, goddess of safety and health, reflected Rome's recognition that power meant little without stability. Her cult expanded during times of plague and political turmoil, when citizens realized that survival itself was fragile. Public ceremonies honored her not just as a healer of bodies, but as protector of the state, blending personal well-being with civic order. Imagine senators praying to Salus for political stability, while ordinary citizens begged for protection from disease. Her temples were reminders that health and security weren't private matters. They were foundations of empire. Forgotten today, Salus reveals how Romans understood the link between public health and power, something we rediscovered only recently. She teaches us that an empire isn't just soldiers and leaders, but also the unseen networks of safety, medicine, and care that keep societies alive. Without Salus, Rome would have crumbled from within long before enemies at the gates broke through. Pax, goddess of peace, was the ultimate irony in Rome's divine lineup. She was celebrated with festivals, statues, and even monumental architecture like the Arapaces. Yet her existence depended on endless conquest. Peace, for Rome, was not the absence of war, but the product of victory. Pax wasn't a gentle mother. She was a stern reminder that tranquility came only after enemies were subdued. Citizens adored her because she meant stability, prosperity, and secure borders. But soldiers knew she was bought with blood. In honoring Pax, Romans admitted a hard truth. Empires don't maintain peace by kindness but by force. Forgotten as a goddess, her concept still lives whenever leaders talk about peace through strength. Pax reveals that Rome's stability rested not on goodwill, but on power carefully wielded. A truth that continues to echo through history. Somnus, the god of sleep, was Rome's quiet physician. In a city that never truly fell silent, markets shouting, fountains humming, patrols clanking, Pasamnus arrived like soft velvet over iron. He wasn't worshipped with spectacle. He worked invisibly, resetting bodies and tempers so the machinery of empire could run tomorrow. Senators schemed better after his visit. Legionaries steadied their nerves. Mothers finally exhaled. Romans' new sleep wasn't laziness. It was maintenance. Priests read dreams and generals weighed them, because Somnus also held the keyhole to meaning. Close your eyes, and the world's noise softened to signs. A bad dream could pause a march. A good one could greenlight a treaty. Somnus made people human, again less brittle, less reckless, so decisions landed cleaner at dawn. His gift wasn't escape but repair, a nightly truce between ambition and exhaustion. If Rome was a forge, Somnus was the cooling bath that kept the metal from cracking. Ignore him, and even marble mines splinter. Morpheus moved inside that darkness like a sculptor of scenes, shaping dreams into stories that felt truer than memory. Romans didn't treat him as a whimsical artist. They treated him like a messenger. He carved omens into sleep with the care of a jeweler, dressing meanings in familiar faces and landscapes so the message would land. A commander might see a bridge fail in night vision and delay a crossing. A merchant might dream of a broken scale and check his weights at sunrise. Morpheus was not fortune-telling so much as perspective. He rehearsed consequences in private theaters, where failure didn't cost blood. When people woke, the world felt rearranged, not by magic, but by clarity. Dreams gave Romans a rehearsal room where pride could be corrected and fear tamed. Morpheus taught that wisdom sometimes arrives when the eyes are closed and the mind is brave enough to wander. Nox, the goddess of night, wasn't simply darkness to Romans. She was a domain with rules. Under her canopy, secrets traveled, lovers planned, thieves gambled, and poets listened for lines. Nox didn't promise safety, but she offered Kuva soft edges. Where the city's harsh outlines blurred, lamps flickered, doorways breathed, and the Tiber whispered back every rumor. Rituals moved differently. After dusk, voices dropped, footsteps learned patience. Nox expanded Rome by subtracting light, revealing the empire as his shadow life, watchmen's roots, smugglers' paths, prayers whispered in fear. Yet she also gifted relief, letting workmen, bakers, and couriers dissolve into anonymity. Nox made room for vulnerability without spectacle. By honoring her, Romans admitted that not everything powerful must be seen. Silence can shield, and darkness can heal the eye that stares too long at glory. In Nox, the city exhaled dangerous, yes, but also tender. A velvet corridor between today's strain and tomorrow's resolve. Laverna, patron of thieves and trickery, reveals Rome's brutal honesty about human nature. Decidi didn't pretend vice didn't exist. It named a goddess for it. Laverna ruled the art of appearing honest while hiding the hand. A deity whispered about in markets where scales could slip and signatures wobble. Air cult, Wazan, an endorsement of crime, so much as a warning label. Deceit has a method, and it always pays itself first. Merchants burned a little incense to keep her away from their ledgers, while cunning minds joked they owed her their luck. In dramas and jokes, Laverna stood in the doorway between reputation and reality. She made Romans sharpen their skepticism, check seals twice, and value fides all the more. If virtue required guardians, vice required a map. And Laverna drew it. By giving her a name, Rome turned shadows into study, so honesty could learn where it leaks. Portunus, guardian of harbors, quays, and river gates, kept Decidia's front door swinging. Rome was a creature of water as much as stone, and Portunus was the hinge. Barges slid along the Tiber with grain and marble. Warships nosed into docks with news sharper than steel. Sailors promised him oil and gallons for fair currents, and dockmasters trusted him to keep quays lucky. Portunus wasn't glamorous, but he was crucial. The choreography of mooring lines, warehouse doors, and tariffs needed a steady god. In his shadow, logistics looked almost sacred. A harbor is where strangers become partners, and storms become stories, and where a single delay can ripple into hunger. Portunus taught Romans that prosperity arrives by boats, but stays by schedule. His blessing was efficiency with a soul, the quiet miracle of goods arriving on time. Without him, empire with him, it glides. Annona personified the grain Saplitha. Empire's Polusu couldn't carve into marble, but felt in every stomach. Bread was politics, and a missed shipment could turn applause into riots by noon. Statues of emperors meant little if bakeries went cold. Annona is the promise that they wouldn't. Her image on coins reassured crowns that barges were full, granaries stocked, and winds favorable. Priests might sing to Jupiter, but administrators prayed to Anna's timetable. She made policy tangible. Laws were edible only when wheat became loaves. In her cult, you see Rome's genius turning logistics into faith. So the city trusted the system. Annona was the soft power behind hard power. The reason festivals glittered and soldiers stayed loyal. She didn't roar, she nourished. In recognizing her, Romans admitted empire is not sustained by triumphs, but by breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Arriving without drama, Moneta watched over minting and memory money as trust, and trust as a story everyone agrees to believe. Her temple neighbored the mint, where silver became salaries, taxes, and plans. Every coin stamped under Moneta's gaze promised weight, purity, and the emperor's word. But she offered more than metal. She guarded reminders, moneri mentoren or advise. and in Moneta lived the idea that currency should teach. Whose face is worthy? Which victories matter? What stability looks like in your palm? When debasement crept in, people didn't just fear poverty, they feared the fraying of assured reality. Moneta's cult was the grammar of value, the discipline that kept commerce honest. She tied markets to meaning so a handshake could travel from Ostia to Antioch and still mean the same thing. Break Moneta's pact, and coins clinked like lies. Fides, goddess of good faith, held Rome together more tightly than any wall. Contracts, oaths, alliances, Fides breathed inside them, making ink as strong as iron. Senators invoked her before votes. Soldiers swore by her when taking the standard. Fides was not sentiment. She was infrastructure. With her, the promise could cross mountains. Without her, even legions grew suspicious. Temples too, Fides glowed with the quiet prestige of reliability. The kind of power that never shouts because it never needs to. In Fides, the empire learned that reputation is a currency that pays interest. Break it, and credit vanishes. Keep it, and doors open before you knock. She taught Romans that trust is not naive, it is engineered, maintained, and fiercely defended. Fides made treaties durable, trade predictable, and friendship strategic. She was the invisible bridge under every deal. Pietas, often translated as duty, braided loyalty to family, gods, and country into one unbreakable rope. She wasn't guilt in a toga. She was alignment, knowing your place and honoring it with dignity. A son burying his father, a general sacrificing before campaign, a magistrate refusing a bribe. Pietas lived in those choices. She gave weight to small acts, turning routine obedience into civic beauty. Rome admired talent, but it trusted Pietas. It meant you could be counted on when applausi, statues of heroes, praised victories, altas to Pietas. Praised constancy. Her lesson aged well. Freedom without duty phrase, and power without humility collapses. Pietas made ambition safe by lashing it to reverence. Mens, the personification of mind and reason, stood like a lamp in Rome's stormier moods. She wasn't abstract to Romans. She was the cool hand on the city's shoulder when panic tempted foolishness. In councils and camps, Mens blessed clarity. The better map, the quieter plan, the calculation that saved a cohort instead of spending it. Festivals in her honor felt almost modern celebrations of composure. Mens kept rumor from ruling and temper from legislating. With her, strategy outran noise. Without her, crowds mistook volume for truth. She taught Romans that intelligence isn't merely knowledge, it's steadiness under heat, the discipline to sift signal from clamor. Mens turned fear into geometry and desire into policy. Reason, made sacred, became a civic habit. Bona Dea, the good goddess, lived in whispers and closed doors. Men were forbidden from her rites, which only deepened the mystery. In a city run by senators and soldiers, Bona Dea's sanctuary was a rare feminine space where power moved differently. Her festivals echoed with wine poured under another name and herbs burned in secrecy. Roman women sought her for fertility, healing, and a sense of control in a society that often denied them one. To men outside, she was both comforting and unnerving. Comforting, because she promised the health of wives and children. Unnerving, because her rituals reminded them that they did not own every corner of Roman life. Scandals erupted when her sanctity was broken, proving how fragile and vital her mystery was. Bona Dea revealed Rome as a double-faced society obsessed with public order yet held together by private rituals. She told that sometimes the strongest glue in an empire is the bond that forms away from the spotlight. Her hiddenness wasn't weakness, it was strength sharpened by privacy, a reminder that faith can thrive in silence, and that power doesn't always need a stage to change lives. Carmenta was Rome's prophetess goddess of birth, fate, and beginnings. Hephaestiva Academentalia honored her as both mother and oracle. She was called upon when new roads were carved, when colonies were planted, when babies came gasping into uncertain air. Carmenta's gift was twofold. She looked forward and backward, guarding transitions with the wisdom of hindsight and foresight. To Romans, she was not a dreamy seer but a practical compass, Midwives invoked her during deliveries, engineers before foundations, generals before expeditions. She warned against hubris while encouraging bravery. In her hymns, destiny was not fixed, it was negotiated, shaped by preparation and awareness. Romans treated her as both caution sign and green light, reminding them that every new path carried both danger and promise. Carmenta's value lay not in predicting the inevitable, but in teaching readiness. She embodied the Roman instinct to plan meticulously, to script outcomes before stepping onto the stage. In honoring her, they confessed a truth still relevant today. Beginnings are fragile, but with clarity and courage, they can become strong foundations instead of stumbling blocks. Larunda, sometimes called the mute nymph, embodied secrets. Silenced by Jupiter for revealing too much, she became patroness of whispers and confidences. Rome tucked her into the rituals of the dead, where silence was sacred and speech dangerous. She was invoked when words became liabilities, when truth could kill more swiftly than swords. Larunda told Romans that discretion is as virtuous, powerful as courage. In politics, survival often hinged not on eloquence, but on knowing when to stay quiet. Senators learned to measure their words. Generals learned to mask intentions. Larunda lived in a space between thought and speech, the pause that protected alliances and preserved dignity. She wasn't celebrated with grand feasts, but her presence was felt every time someone swallowed a dangerous sentence. Romans respected the lesson. Empires don't only collapse from enemies at the gate, but from loose tongues inside the walls. Larunda's silence wasn't emptiness, it was armor. Hamith reminded people that restraint can be a shield, and that sometimes the greatest power lies not in proclamation, but in keeping the unspoken locked away. Sores, the spirit of luck and fate, embodied Rome's obsession with fortune's wheel. Soldiers tossed dice in his shadow. Merchants prayed over contracts. Emperors wondered if his favor could outlast ambition. Sores represented the uncontrollable, the role you couldn't rehearse, the outcome you couldn't legislate. Romans both feared and courted him, erecting temples and inscribing charms. His presence exposed the limits of planning. You could drill legions to perfection, but a storm could scatter ships. You could bribe a senator, but one rumor could swing a vote. Sores was not a cruel god, but he was indifferent, reminding Romans that control was never total. His lesson was humility. Greatness could tilt in a moment, and power that forgot luck's role often overreached. Romans acknowledged him not to surrender, but to stay alert. If luck was a coin toss, wisdom meant preparing for both sides. Sores embodied Rome's balancing act between discipline and chance, teaching that resilience grows not from denying uncertainty but from absorbing it. He made the empire flexible, ready to pivot when fortune's dice clattered the other way. Securitas, goddess of security, appeared on coins as a calm woman leaning against a column. She wasn't a warlike protector but a symbol of stability. Her presence was Rome's promise that citizens could sleep without fear, that fields would not burn, that streets would not riot tomorrow. Emperors minted her image to project calm even during storms, because Securitas was as much psychology as reality. People believe what they feel. A city that believes it is safe behaves orderly. A city that senses instability devours itself. Securitas taught rulers that the appearance of calm is sometimes as vital as actual peace. Her worship wasn't about rituals but about policy. Grain distributions, patrols, walls repaired, fires doused quickly. Every act that reassured the masses honored her. Securitas whispered the truth of empire. Control is brittle without trust. Keep her steady, and citizens build loyally. Lose her, and panic unravels all. She was proof that strength isn't only in armies marching, but in mothers tucking children into bed without glancing nervously at the door. Equitas was the goddess of fairness and balance, the divine auditor in a world tilted by power. Merchants weighed goods in her name. Judges invoked her before verdicts. Emperors pressed her image onto coins to reassure the people. Equitas wasn't about abstract equality. She was about proportional justice. Give each what is due. No more, no less. Rome was ruthless, but it was also pragmatic. For empire to function, Transactions needed trust, and trust needed perceived fairness. Equitas symbolized the scales that made markets flow and contracts stick. When she was honored, citizens believed the system worked. When she was neglected, riots followed. Equitas embodied Rome's genius, dressing pragmatism in divine robes so fairness became sacred duty. She taught that prosperity rests not on greed, but on balance. Not on exploitation, but on reciprocity. Even emperors bowed to her image, because a ruler who ignored fairness found loyalty evaporating. Equitas was not about kindness. She was about survival through symmetry. She kept the empire from collapsing under the weight of its own inequalities. Virtues personified courage, but not just battlefield bravery. To Romans, virtues was every act of grit that pushed ambition forward enduring hardship, speaking truth, risking loss for honor. Statues showed him as a soldier, but his spirit burned into base, negotiations, and reforms. Virtues told that greatness is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act. Anyway, soldiers swore by him before campaigns. Senators evoked him before hard votes. Virtues carried weight because he required sacrifice. Easy victories never fed his flame. Only risks did. Rome tied him tightly to Gloria, because courage without recognition faded. Yet virtues was not vanity. It was currency. Every citizen, regardless of station, was measured by how they answered pressure. He made courage less about moments of glory and more about consistency and struggle. In virtues, Romans celebrated not only the daring general, but also the farmer who stood firm against drought, the artisan who fought for his craft. He democratized bravery, proving empire rests on countless small acts of endurance. Honos, the god of honor, often paired with virtues, was Rome's way of institutionalizing respect. Victories were dedicated to him, temples raised in his name, because honor was more than reputation. It was Rome's glue. Honos was the scoreboard of dignity. Lose him, and even wealth or power looked hollow. Honos whispered that how achievements were gained mattered as much as what was achieved. His cult encouraged leaders to care about legacy, not just conquest. To Romans, honor was not private, it was public property. Citizens invested in it, and communities thrived when honor was preserved. Honos taught that betrayal poisons trust faster than any enemy spear. He kept virtues from becoming reckless, anchoring courage to accountability. Rome understood that without honor, glory curdled into tyranny. Honos was their brake, the measure that reminded leaders and soldiers alike that ambition must still answer to reputation, that empire must walk with dignity if it wanted to endure beyond victories. Flora, goddess of flowers and renewal, might seem trivial beside war gods, but she anchored Rome's rhythm of joy. Her festival, the Floralia, burst with colors, plays, games, and celebrations of fertility. She was Rome's reminder that life was not only about conquest but about seasons. Flora represented abundance after scarcity, laughter after mourning, spring after winter. Soldiers returned to her festivals to remember beauty. Citizens celebrated her to trust in cycles. Flora's power was subtle but deep. She recharged morale. No empire survives on discipline alone. It needs delight. Flora embodied Rome's embrace of pleasure as part of civic duty. Her worship said, "Rome wins not only by marching but by blooming." She showed that even the hardest city needed softness, that festivals were not distractions but reinforcements. Flora's blossoms didn't just decorate, they stitched resilience into the culture. Rome proved that power without celebration becomes sterile. Flora was their promise that empire was not just built, it was lived. Didia, worshipped by the Arval brethren, was Rome's agricultural pulse. Embodied, she wasn't famous to the masses, but her rituals fed everyone. Her priests performed elaborate ceremonies in secret groves outside the city, blessing crops and fields. Didia represented the empire's most essential truth. No food, no Rome. Grain, vines, olives. Her touch was in every bite, every amphora, every loaf that kept soldiers marching and citizens content. Didia wasn't spectacle, but sustenance. She proved that survival depended less on marble forums than on fertile soil. Rome elevated her through careful ritual, emphasizing discipline, purity, and tradition. She was a reminder that empire's foundation was biological, not political. Without her, even legions starved. Deities cults illustrated Rome's pragmatic spirituality. Invest heavily in gods who deliver tangible returns. She was not abstract but direct. Bless the crops. Bless the empire. Her quiet power kept the entire system upright. Invisible yet indispensable. As vital as air and water, Clochina was the goddess of sewers. And while her title might sound laughable to modern ears, the Romans treated her as essential to life itself. Tiklaka, Maxima, Rome's enormous sewer system, wasn't just engineering brilliance, it was the backbone of the city's survival. Without it, floods would drown the streets, waste would poison the air, and epidemics would spread like wildfire. Clochina symbolized the belief that even unseen forces deserve divine respect. In honoring her, Romans revealed something profound. Their empire wasn't built only on conquest and politics, but also on invisible systems that kept millions alive. A clogged drain might seem minor, but to the Romans, neglecting it meant angering Clochina, risking disease, chaos, and the gods' displeasure. By sanctifying sanitation, they elevated practicality to holiness. Clochina's cults reminded them daily that greatness rests not on marble or gold, but on the hidden, unglamorous foundations beneath their feet. Fides was the goddess of trust, and trust is what made Rome's vast empire possible. Armies could march, laws could be written, taxes collected, but without trust-binding agreements, the whole machine collapsed. Senators swore by her when sealing alliances, merchants invoked her before contracts, and soldiers pledged loyalty in her name. Unlike gods of thunder or war, Fides wasn't about spectacle, it was about reliability, consistency, the invisible glue of society. To the Romans, trust wasn't just social etiquette, it was divine currency. Break it, and you didn't just lose. Face, you risked divine punishment. That belief gave contracts and treaties a sacred edge. It turned promises into pillars. Without Fides, betrayal spread, revolts brewed, and Rome cracked from within. She was proof that even the most militarized empire needed cooperation, not just force. Next came Securitas, goddess of security, who wasn't worshipped with battles or sacrifices but with reassurance. She appeared on Roman coins as a calm woman leaning against a column, embodying stability. Emperors used her image to project confidence, even in troubled times. To the average citizen, Securitas meant more than armies at the border. It meant food supplies arriving on time, streets remaining peaceful, and families feeling safe enough to sleep without fear. Her cult wasn't flashy, but psychological. When people believed in her presence, panic subsided. The lesson she taught was clear. Perception of safety is as important as actual safety. An empire without reassurance unravels quickly. Rome, in its genius, elevated this principle into divinity. Aquitas, goddess of fairness, made trade and law function. She appeared as a woman holding scales, balancing justice and equality. For Rome, fairness wasn't idealistic, it was practical. Merchants needed to believe contracts were honored, judges needed to believe verdicts mattered, and citizens needed to feel the system wasn't entirely rigged. Aquitas embodied that fragile balance. She wasn't about making everyone equal, but about proportionality, giving each their due. Emperors stamped her onto coins to signal honesty and governance, though reality didn't always match. Yet even when Rome failed her, the idea of Aquitas held power. She represented the ideal people could appeal to, and ideals, once established, become harder to kill than armies. She taught Romans that fairness wasn't kindness, it was survival. Virtues, personification of courage, wasn't only about swinging a sword. Romans saw virtues in a soldier who marched despite fear, in a senator who spoke an unpopular truth, in a farmer who endured hardship to feed the city. Virtues was bravery stretched across life, not just battlefield moments. He demanded risk, sacrifice, and persistence. Easy victories didn't count. Only acts that cost something carried his blessing. That made him a demanding but inspiring figure. Rome tied virtues closely to Gloria, because courage without recognition faded too quickly. Yet virtues wasn't vanity, it was grit. He reminded Romans that empire was built not just by generals but by countless small acts of endurance. Honos, god of honor, walked hand in hand with virtues. Courage without honor could become recklessness, while honor without courage faded into cowardice. Rome paired them in temples, rituals, and speeches. Honos was about reputation, the scoreboard of dignity. To Romans, honor wasn't private, it was collective. Lose it, and even wealth or power became meaningless. Honos urged leaders to think beyond ambition, toward legacy. Betray poisoned trust faster than any spear. Honos kept generals from cutting corners, senators from falling into disgrace. He was the brake on unchecked ambition, reminding Rome that how victories were achieved mattered as much as winning itself. Without Honos, virtues risked becoming dangerous. Flora, goddess of flowers and renewal, might seem trivial beside gods of war, but she anchored Rome's rhythm of joy. Her festival, Floralia, burst with color, plays, and celebrations of fertility. In a city obsessed with conquest, Flora reminded citizens that life was also about laughter, beauty, and renewal. Soldiers returned from campaigns to her festival, recharging their spirits. Citizens celebrated to trust in cycles. Winter would end, fields would bloom, life would continue. Flora's blossoms weren't just decoration, they were medicine for morale. Her presence taught Rome that no empire survives on discipline alone. It also needs moments of delight, softness, and hope. Didia, worshipped by the Arval brethren, tied Rome to the soil. She wasn't widely known but deeply vital. Her priests performed secretive rituals in sacred groves outside the city, blessing crops and fields. Didia embodied Rome's truth. No food, no empire. Armies march on grain. Citizens riot without bread. Her cults emphasized purity and tradition, reminding people that survival rested less on marble forums and more on fertile earth. Didia wasn't glamorous, but she was indispensable. Rome understood that even the greatest city depends on biology, not politics. Bless the fields, bless the empythet, was our simple but profound creed. Larunda, the mute nymph, became goddess of secrets. Silenced by Jupiter for revealing too much, she turned into patroness of discretion. Rome placed her in rituals of the dead, where silence carried weight. She represented restraint to the wisdom of knowing when not to speak. Senators, generals, and diplomats lived in her shadow. Words could destroy alliances faster than armies. Larunda's myth reminded Romans that survival sometimes depended not on eloquence but on silence. She wasn't a goddess of emptiness, but of protection. Her power lived in the pause, the unspoken, the shield of discretion. Empires often fall from within, not from invaders. And Larunda embodied that truth. Soars, the spirit of luck, represented Rome's relationship with chance. Soldiers tossed dice under his gaze. Merchants prayed to him over deals, and emperors feared his whims. Swords symbolized what couldn't be planned. Storms scattering fleets, rumors toppling leaders, chance deciding outcomes. Rome, obsessed with discipline, admitted through swords that control is never total. He wasn't cruel, but he was indifferent. His presence taught humility. You could train, plan, and prepare, but fortune still decided. Romans respected that lesson, turning luck itself into something sacred. They didn't worship source to surrender but to remind themselves to adapt. He was chaos turned divine, the coin toss made holy. Pax, the goddess of peace, was one of Rome's quietest yet most ambitious deities. Her image appeared on coins, holding an olive branch or a scepter, reminding citizens that peace was as much a project as war. Romans didn't worship Pax out of naive optimism. They knew peace required maintenance, often through strength. Pax Romana wasn't about absence of conflict, but about Rome being so dominant that no one dared disturb it. By honoring her, emperors projected stability, promising citizens not endless campaigns, but secure lives. Pax was political branding and spiritual aspiration rolled into one. She taught Romans that peace is never free, it's built, guarded, and constantly renewed. Her cult reminded people that real empire isn't measured by battles won, but by generations living without fear. Pox whispered that victory is hollow if it cannot produce quiet streets and laughter in homes. She was Rome's dream of eternity. Wrapped in olive leaves, Spes, goddess of hope, embodied optimism in a city that often balanced on the edge of despair. Soldiers marching into uncertain battles carried her name. Farmers facing drought prayed to her for survival. Spes wasn't about guarantee, she was about possibility. To Romans, hope was not a luxury, but a tool. It kept citizens enduring through hardship and legions pressing on when defeat seemed close. Temples to Spes stood as reminders that no matter how bad today looked, tomorrow could open with fortune's smile. She gave resilience, a divine form. Romans weren't blind to tragedy, but Spes made them believe endurance had meaning. Without her, despair would rot the empire faster than enemy blades. Spes showed them that hope wasn't weakness, it was survival fuel. In every coin flip of fate, she was the whisper. Hold on, better days might come. For Rome, that whisper was enough to keep marching. Concordia, goddess of harmony, was invoked when political strife threatened to tear the Senate apart. A temple stood proudly in the forum, a constant reminder that unity mattered. Romans often fought bitterly among themselves, but Concordia symbolized the glue that held the pieces together. She was more than idealism. She was strategy. A divided Senate, a rebellious populace, or quarreling generals could unravel Rome faster than barbarians. Concordia's image on coins and monuments reminded leaders to cooperate for survival. Her lesson was blunt. Harmony isn't about friendship, it's about coexistence. She didn't demand love, only balance. Romans knew they didn't have to like each other, but they had to work together. Concordia showed that peace at home was as crucial as victory abroad. She embodied compromise turned divine, teaching that empires fall less from enemies and more from Fortuna, goddess of fortune, was one of Rome's most unpredictable deities. She could bless or curse with the same hand. Her wheel spun constantly, lifting some and crushing others. Soldiers, merchants, emperors all acknowledged her power. Shrines to Fortuna dotted the empire, where people begged her favor before risks. She wasn't just chance, she was destiny in motion. Fortuna taught Romans humility. No matter how disciplined or powerful, one twist of her wheel could change everything. That belief made Rome cautious, always preparing for the unexpected. Emperors tried to claim Fortuna's blessing, but they knew her loyalty was fickle. She represented life's volatility, reminding citizens that stability was an illusion. Fortuna didn't promise furnace, she promised change. Romans learned to adapt, to pivot when her wheel turned. Her cult was a confession. Even the greatest empire knew it couldn't control everything. Salus, goddess of health and safety, embodied the empire's obsession with well-being. She wasn't only about individual survival, but about collective health. Festivals in her honor focused on public rituals, sacrifices, and vows for the empire's safety. She symbolized the link between personal wellness and state stability. If disease ravaged Rome, the empire weakened. Salus represented the idea that protecting citizens was protecting Rome itself. Emperors tied their legitimacy to her, presenting themselves as guardians of safety. Salus taught Romans that empire wasn't just territory, but people kept alive and functioning. She whispered that no conquest matters if citizens die of plague. Rome learned to invest in aqueducts, baths, and medicine not only as luxuries, but as survival strategies. Salus turned public health into divinity. Centuries before modern systems emerged, her cult showed that Rome's power was as much about clean water as it was about swords. Ops, goddess of abundance, was tied to harvests, wealth, and prosperity. A name gave us the word opulence. Farmers thanked her for crops, and generals for spoils. Rome's wealth wasn't only in conquest, it was in the steady flow of grain, wine, and olive oil. Ops was celebrated in December during the Opalia festivals linked to Saturn. She embodied the principle that abundance wasn't greed but foundation. Without surplus, armies couldn't march, cities couldn't thrive, and temples couldn't be built. Ops reminded Romans that prosperity came from both the soil and smart storage. She represented foresight, teaching that saving and preparing for scarcity was divine wisdom. A cult proved that empire wasn't only powered by swords, but by granaries and markets. Ops whispered the simple truth. You cannot rule if you cannot feed. Her presence made Rome's bounty feel like destiny, not just chance. Libertas, goddess of freedom, carried weight in a society built on both liberty and slavery. Romans saw her as the symbol of political freedom for citizens, embodied in the right to speak, vote, and resist tyranny. Statues of Libertas often stood where political rallies occurred, a reminder of Rome's republican ideals. Emperors co-opted her image to present themselves as protectors of freedom, even as they tightened control. To Romans, Libertas wasn't about universal equality, but about rights within their civic identity. The cult inspired pride, but also hypocrisy. Still, she mattered, because she gave Romans a sense of dignity beyond brute survival. She reminded them that to be Roman meant having a voice. Her power lay in the idea that freedom was sacred even, if not for all. Libertas proved that empires sell ideals to survive, and those ideals shape people's loyalty more than fear ever can. Victoria, goddess of victory, was Rome's most celebrated companion to Mars. She wasn't only about triumph in war, but about the permanence of conquest. Statues of Victoria filled public spaces, and her image stood in the Senate House itself, a reminder that Rome's identity was bound to winning. Soldiers prayed to her before battle and thanked her afterward. She embodied the belief that victory wasn't luck but divine favor. Toulouse was not just militariat, was spiritual failure. Emperors tied their legitimacy to her, flaunting her blessings after campaigns. Victoria reminded citizens that their empire existed because the gods willed them to win. Her cult was political, but it was also deeply emotional. She taught Romans to see themselves as chosen to conquer, to endure, and to outlast rivals. Victoria was just about battles won. She was about the belief that Rome's destiny itself was unstoppable. Nox, goddess of night, was a figure both feared and revered. She embodied darkness, mystery, and rest, but also danger and uncertainty. In her domain, secrets thrived, crimes unfolded, and dreams were born. Romans didn't celebrate her with festivals, but acknowledged her presence daily. Night wasn't just absence of light, it was a realm ruled by divine law. Nox symbolized the balance between order and chaos. She represented rest for the weary, but also the fear of what prowled unseen. To farmers, she was peace. To soldiers, she was risk. Romans respected Nox as the silent backdrop of life, teaching them to embrace both calm and vigilance. Her cult was philosophical, more acknowledgement than worship. Nox reminded Rome that no empire could escape cycles of day and night, clarity and uncertainty. She embodied life's contrasts, whispering that even in the greatest city, darkness always waits. Somnus, god of sleep, was Nox's companion. His role seemed passive, yet Romans recognized his power. Sleep was healing, escape, and vulnerability all at once. Soldiers collapsing after campaigns, senators weary from debates, farmers exhausted after harvest all surrendered to some. Myths portrayed him as gentle but inescapable. No emperor, no matter how mighty, could resist him. He embodied equality and rest. Somnus also carried an edge. Dreams. In his arms, visions appeared, shaping choices, stirring fears, or sparking prophecies. Romans treated dreams with respect, believing God spoke through them. Somnus reminded them that power doesn't just thrive in waking hours, it is also shaped in silence. He taught humility. Even the unstoppable need pause. Somnus proved that rest wasn't weakness but survival, a hidden strength that allowed Rome to continue. He turned sleep itself into divinity, weaving the empire's fate in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and transitions, was uniquely Roman. With one face looking forward and the other backward, he symbolized duality, past and future, war and peace, openings and endings. His shrine in the Forum at gates that opened during war and closed only in times of peace, a visual reminder of Rome's state. Janus wasn't just ceremonial, he reflected Rome's obsession with order and chaos. He governed thresholds, doorways, and moments of decision. Every contract signed, every journey begun, Every new year celebrated Janus was invoked. He taught Romans that life is always in transition, and decisions shape destiny. His worship made time and change themselves feel divine. He wasn't about permanence, but about movement. Janus whispered that beginnings carry endings within them, and endings are just another kind of start. Rome found comfort in this duality, knowing their empire was constantly shifting yet always enduring. Vesta, goddess of the hearth, symbolized stability at the very heart of Rome. Her temple contained the eternal flame, tended by the Vestal Virgins, a priesthood with immense responsibility. That fire wasn't just religious, it was political. As long as it burned, Rome endured. Vesta represented family, home, and the collective soul of the city. Her cult emphasized purity, sacrifice, and discipline. For Romans, Vesta's presence connected private households to the empire itself. Every kitchen fire mirrored hers. To let the flame die was unthinkable, for it meant Rome's spirit faltered. Vesta's power was quiet, but absolute. She embodied the idea that empire wasn't only built by soldiers, but sustained by domestic stability. Her lesson was profound. Great cities aren't powered only by conquests, but by shared rituals that make people feel connected. Through Vesta, Romans found comfort that their empire was not just geography, it was home. Aurora, goddess of dawn, painted Rome's mornings with divine renewal. She opened the gates of the sun, heralding each new day. To Romans, she wasn't just a poetic figure, she was hope embodied in light. Aurora represented fresh beginnings, resilience after darkness, and the promise that no night lasts forever. Farmers rising at dawn, soldiers preparing for campaigns, merchants opening stalls all looked to her presence. She reminded them that survival meant embracing cycles. Each morning, Rome was reborn. Aurora's role tied into Rome's sense of destiny. Just as the sun returned, so would Rome endure any crisis. Myths described her as eternal yet fleeting, vanishing quickly into daylight. Her divinity captured life's fragility and persistence at once. Aurora taught Romans to honor renewal, to see each day as a chance to reset. She was divine optimism, turning ordinary sunrise into a sacred affirmation of resilience. Genius, the divine spirit assigned to individuals, families, and places, was central to Roman spirituality. Every person had a genius, a guiding force, shaping their fate. Emperors emphasized theirs, presenting their personal genius as national destiny. Romans offered sacrifices to their genius on birthdays, blending personal milestones with religious duty. It wasn't worship of ego, but acknowledgement of unseen influence. The concept extended beyond people's cities, households. Even legions had their own genius. It gave Rome a framework where everything, from empire to kitchen, had spirit. Genius made the abstract feel personal, reminding Romans that destiny wasn't just cosmic, but intimate. It connected private life to collective history. In venerating genius, Romans confessed that no one acts alone. Every success was shared, every failure collective. Genius was their way of embedding spirituality into daily life, turning each decision into communion with the divine. Lares, household gods, guarded family homes and private spaces. Small statues of them stood in shrines within Roman houses, and daily rituals honored their presence. Unlike distant Olympians, Lares were personal protectors, tied to land, ancestors, and kinship. They symbolized continuity, binding generations through shared worship. Travelers prayed to Lares before leaving, asking protection on roads. Soldiers invoked them for safety abroad. The cult of Lares blurred the line between religion and routine. They weren't grand gods but everyday guardians. They embodied Rome's belief that the sacred lived not only in temples, but in kitchens and courtyards. Lares taught Romans that family was the foundation of empire. An empire survives not through walls but through households united in faith. By honoring Lares, Romans acknowledged that strength begins in small circles, and loyalty to the home shapes loyalty to the state. They turned domestic life into a sacred act of resilience. Penates, companions of the Lares, safeguarded food stores and domestic abundance. They symbolized Rome's obsession with stability and survival. In every Roman household, prayers to the Penates were as common as meals, ensuring kitchens remained full and families secure. Their importance wasn't dramatic, but essential without sustenance. No city thrives. Emperors tied their legitimacy to the penates, boasting of protecting Rome's grain supply. Wars were won or lost not only by swords but by bread. The penates represented foresight, the wisdom of preparing for scarcity and honoring abundance. They embodied Rome's idea that empire wasn't abstract glory, but tangible survival. To Romans, feeding the people was sacred work. By venerating penates, they reminded themselves that divinity lived in ordinary acts. Breaking bread, sharing meals, storing grain. The penates turned kitchens into temples, and every dinner into proof of Rome's endurance. Somnia, goddess of dreams, occupied the mysterious bridge between sleep and waking. Romans treated dreams with caution, believing they could carry messages from gods. Somnia symbolized possibility visions that could warn, inspire, or deceive. Soldiers dreamed of battles, farmers of harvests, senators of power. Her role gave meaning to the subconscious, turning nightly visions into divine communication. Dream interpreters gained influence, decoding symbols and omens. Somnia made Romans aware that destiny wasn't only shaped by daylight actions, but also by shadowy whispers of the night. Her cult revealed their belief in unseen influences, teaching that reality is layered. Somnia embodied imagination itself. She turned vulnerability sleep into an opportunity for insight. To Romans, her presence was both comfort and fear, proof that minds never rest. Somnia made the empire feel connected to mysteries beyond logic, ensuring Rome always looks for meaning in the unpredictable. Portunus, god of harbors, controlled trade and naval prosperity. His cult reflected Rome's expansion beyond Italy into a maritime empire. Merchants prayed to him before voyages, and sailors offered sacrifices for safe return. Without Portunus, Rome's grain fleets from Egypt took commerce across the Mediterranean risked disaster. He symbolized the empire's dependence on sea routes. Portunus wasn't only about survival, he represented Rome's vision as global. His blessings tied empire to movement, to exchange of goods and cultures. His festival, the Portunalia, reminded citizens that harbors weren't just commercial, they were lifelines. Portunus embodied Rome's pragmatic spirituality, acknowledging that power rested as much on ships as on legions. He taught that empires flourish not only by conquering land but by mastering seas. His cult turned docks into temples and anchors into sacred symbols of Rome's enduring reach across waters. Vulcanus, god of rivers, reflected Rome's reliance on waterways. He represented flow, fertility, and connection. The Tiber, Rome's lifeline, embodied his blessing. Without rivers, trade stalled, crops withered, and cities suffocated. Vulcanus symbolized continuity, the eternal flow linking generations. Romans saw rivers not just as geography, but as divine arteries carrying life. His festival, the Volturnalia, celebrated water's abundance, reminding citizens that empire was as fragile as its resources. Vulcanus taught Romans humility. They could command armies, but not stop currents. He embodied adaptability, showing that survival meant moving with the flow, not resisting it. His cult tied Rome to its natural foundations, teaching that no walls or legions mattered without rivers feeding fields and sustaining cities. Vulcanus turned geography into spirituality, proving Rome's power wasn't only man-made, it was also nature's gift. Clocina, goddess of the sewers, might sound unglamorous, but she embodied one of Rome's greatest strengths: engineering. De Cloaca Maxima, Rome's grand sewer system, was seen as a divine creation under her care. Romans didn't separate sanitation from spirituality. Keeping the city clean meant honoring Clocina. Her cult symbolized practicality turned sacred. She reminded citizens that empires fall not from lack of glory, but from disease and neglect. Clocina taught that even the humblest work carries divine weight. In worshipping her, Romans celebrated infrastructure as holy, proof that true power comes not only from conquests, but from maintaining order in daily life. Didia, the goddess of growth, oversaw agriculture's rhythm. Her priests, the Arval Brethren, conducted rituals in sacred groves, ensuring fields remained fertile. To Romans, she represented abundance and stability. Her presence made the cycle of sowing and reaping feel eternal. Anchoring the empire in nature's rhythm, Rome's military might rested on her blessings. For no army marches without grain. Festivals in her honor united citizens in gratitude. Turning harvest into worship, deities embodied Rome's respect for cycles of renewal. She reminded them that conquest is fleeting but cultivation sustains. Her cult turned plows into sacred tools and fields into temples of survival. Spes, goddess of hope, offered Romans light during uncertainty. She wasn't about blind optimism, but about resilience, the belief that tomorrow held possibility. Soldiers prayed to her before battles. Families invoked her in hardship, and statesmen turned to her in crises. Spes symbolized persistence, the courage to endure. She was honored with altars in public spaces, reminding citizens that even empires rely on hope. Her presence revealed Rome's vulnerability. Despite its power, it leaned on faith in unseen futures. Spes taught Romans, the strength comes not from certainty, but from belief in endurance. She was proof that hope itself is divine. Victoria, goddess of victory, personified Rome's ambition. More than a symbol, she was invoked before campaigns and celebrated after triumphs. Temples, too, her decorated the city, and her image appeared on coins, embedding her presence in daily transactions. Victoria wasn't just military, she was ideological. She taught Romans to believe conquest was destiny. Emperors tied legitimacy to her favor, presenting victories as divine proof of their rule. But Victoria also symbolized fragility. Her absence meant downfall. Romans understood victory as fleeting and sacred. Through her, triumph became ritualized, making war not just politics but spirituality. So made Romaeus, ambition, feel inevitable. Fides, goddess of trust, embodied contracts, loyalty, and oaths. Her cult was essential for politics and commerce alike. In Rome, words carried divine weight, and to break trust was sacrilege. Temples dedicated to Fides held records of treaties, symbolizing her presence as guardian of alliances. She turned abstract promises into sacred bonds. For Romans, society functioned because Fides demanded honesty. Soldiers swore by her, merchants prayed to her, and senators invoked her in speeches. She reminded Rome that empire rested not only on force, but on reliability. Fides made integrity divine, teaching that betrayal was not just political, it was cosmic offense. Pietas, goddess of duty, embodied devotion to family, gods, and state. Her cult symbolized the hierarchy of Roman values. To live with pietas meant fulfilling obligations, even at personal cost. Stories of heroes like Aeneas reflected her virtue, sacrificing personal desire for destiny. Pietas wasn't abstract. She was lived daily in obedience, service, and sacrifice. Romans saw her as glue binding individuals to collective identity. Without pietas, empire unraveled. Her worship taught that greatness required duty before pleasure, responsibility before ambition. She reminded citizens that their lives served something larger. Pietas turned loyalty into spirituality, sanctifying Rome's relentless discipline. Nox, goddess of night, embodied mystery and power. She wasn't merely darkness, but the cosmic womb from which everything emerged. Romans saw her as older than even Jupiter, a primal force shaping destiny. Nox symbolized silence, dreams, and the unknown. She reminded Romans that life's greatest powers often lie hidden. Her worship revealed their fascination with duality. Light depended on shadow. Nox wasn't feared but respected. She embodied limits, teaching Romans humility before forces beyond comprehension. By venerating Nox, Romans acknowledged that empire's brilliance was born from mystery. She symbolized both endings and beginnings, turning night into sacred threshold. Somnus, god of sleep, offered respite from Rome's intensity. In a city of ambition, Somnus embodied surrender. Sleep was divine, a necessary pause in the rhythm of conquest. His role reflected Rome's belief that even rest served destiny. Without sleep, soldiers faltered, senators erred, and farmers weakened. Somnus symbolized vulnerability turned sacred, proving that strength requires softness. Myths described him as gentle, cloaking the world in calm. Romans honored somnus not for glory, but for balance. He taught that rest was survival, and survival was power. Through him, Romans embraced the paradox that empire endured. By knowing when to yield, Mors, goddess of death, reminded Romans of inevitability. She symbolized equality. The truth that emperors and peasants alike faced the same end. Death wasn't feared as chaos, but accepted as order. Her cult revealed Rome's practica spirituality. Empire was vast, but mortality humbled all. Festivals of remembrance tied her presence to family continuity. Soldiers embraced her, acknowledging risk without despair. Mors embodied reality itself, stripping away illusions of permanence. She taught Romans that greatness was measured not by avoiding death, but by facing it with honor. Through her, empire gained perspective. Every triumph was temporary. Every life, part of a cycle.